United Nations this morning with a big address to world leaders tomorrow. What will the president say? Here to discuss someone who has been there, former British Prime Minister Tony Blair. Mr. Prime Minister, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
So President Trump's been to Europe. He has spoken to European leaders, addressed the world before a few times, but this is his first time at the United Nations. His previous speeches, he was sort of greeted with side-eye, curiosity, maybe some scorn in some places. What does the president need to say this week?
I think it's quite an important moment because this is the first time the world as a whole will be looking at the American president, hearing him. And I think there needs to be clarity, consistency in the American approach. And, you know, people want always the same thing from America and from its president. They want to know that America's strong enough to stand with its allies and to stand up to its enemies. And therefore, I think what people will be looking for today, tomorrow when the president speaks, is an idea of what are the principles that are going to guide American policy, and is there clarity and consistency around those?
Are there those things right now? Is that lacking?
I think there's a mixture of sort of curiosity and anxiety, but this is not totally unnatural when you get a new president coming in. However, I do think this is a very important moment. There's so many challenging issues in the world today, not least obviously North Korea, but people in Europe will want to know, is this alliance still strong? People in the Middle East will want to know where America stands on the issues of the Middle East today. And I think if people get that clarity message, that will be great. But that's what they'll be looking for. They want to, you know, America's the most powerful country in the world. What everyone wants to know is, where does America stand and where do they stand in relation to them?
And of course, I mean, in terms of uncertainty, there's the latest terror attack in London. And sadly, it wasn't the first this year. I think there's been 5 terror attacks. We have a list of all of them. I don't need to remind you, of course, of some of them, but just horrible ones. I mean, obviously, van attacks, the bridge attacks, you know, also the Manchester Arena bombing at the concert. What's going on in London? Is there something, are there lessons to be learned here? Is something failing?
I think there's a lesson to be learned because it's happening all over Europe and indeed all over the world. You know, one of the things my institute does is actually track day by day terrorist incidents across the world. There's literally not a corner of the world, apart from perhaps South America, where this isn't a daily occurrence. So the question, I think, is the thing I would focus on is, obviously you take security measures to defeat those who are planning violence. But I think the deeper question is, how do you defeat the ideology of this radical Islamist, you know, idea?
What's the answer to that?
The answer is, I think, that you've got to weed out those elements that are promoting this, whether it's on the internet or those people who are giving messages to people, turning them into these types of people who are engaged in violent acts against our way of life. And I think this needs to be done on a far bigger scale than we have at the moment.
This is how President Trump first responded to the latest terror attack in London. He put out a statement on Twitter. He said, "Another attack in London by a loser terrorist. These are sick and demented people who are in the sights of Scotland Yard, must be proactive." This is how the current Prime Minister, Theresa May, responded to the president's statement. Listen to this.
I don't think it's helpful for anyone to speculate on what is an ongoing investigation. It is necessary for us to look, as we are doing, at whether our police and security services have the full capabilities, the powers that they need. Of course, we review after any incident that takes place, and we have had, sadly, a number of terrorist attacks in the UK.
So put yourself back in 10 Downing Street. Had you been Prime Minister at the time that President Trump put out that statement saying that these 2 people, these terrorists, were in the sight of Scotland Yard before apparently having the evidence in front of him, what would your reaction have been? How would you have felt?
Well, I think I agree with what the Prime Minister's just said. Look, in the end, by the way, the most important thing for us is not what anyone's tweeting about it, it's how we actually deal with it. And you should know that we are foiling plots the whole time. And so is, by the way, virtually every other European country. And this is why I say to you, you've got to deal with this at a security level, but then deeper down, you've got to be asking yourself, how is this ideology and the violence that comes with it getting transmitted, particularly to younger people worldwide? And that's a whole other question with a whole other set of policies attached to it.
Well, look, President Trump thinks that the answer is a stricter, bigger travel ban. I mean, he believes, if you believe the rhetoric around his travel ban, that if you prevent people like this from coming into the United States, that we'll be safe. here, and that there has to be a better way to prevent the people like the teenagers who just pulled this off in London from even coming into your country.
Yeah, but you see, part of the problem we've got in the UK and other places in Europe is often you've got homegrown people that are engaged in this.
Yeah, here too, by the way.
Yeah, so of course you've got questions to do with borders and security, and these are very important questions. But I really do believe the deeper question, I mean, right now, for example, around the world, you have millions of young people being educated in religious madrasas, in very strict terms, dedicated to an ideology that preaches hatred against those that are different. Now, if you've got that going on in the world, yes, of course, you've got to protect yourself by security methods, but in the end, you've got to be rooting out that type of education and that type of propaganda. And this is where, obviously, the internet's also very important. One of the things we work on in my institute is how you manage to stop these types of messages getting through to people. When they go onto these sites, you divert them onto sites that are more positive. But this requires, frankly, a revolution in approach way beyond anything we've done so far, because otherwise, I'm afraid this problem is going to grow.
And again, you talk about your institute, the Institute for Global Change. Do you feel like you're swimming, against the tide right now when nationalism seems to be the trend?
Well, I think it's important we rediscover the importance of international engagement. I mean, one of the things we're doing this week is looking at that whole group of countries across the northern part of sub-Saharan Africa. Poor countries, exploding populations, weak government, extremism rife. Unless we're supporting them now, they are going to be a source of future terrorism, of waves of migration that are going to destabilize our societies further. So, my view is we need a completely different, much more radical, much more far-sighted approach to dealing with this than we have at the moment.
And if people want to learn more, they can go to the Institute for Global Change and find out all the things that you're working on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Great to have you here,
It's a pleasure.
Mr. Blair. We're following a lot of news this morning, so let's get right to it.
Very important week for the president. The world will be listening.
If the United States has to defend itself in any way, North Korea will be destroyed.
This is probably one of the most serious national security crises we've faced.
President Trump calling North Korea's leader Rocket Man as he prepares to address world leaders for the first time.
He's a disruptor. He enjoys engaging on social media.
Rockets we ought to probably not laugh too much about because they do represent a grave threat.
Even as people try to recover from Irma, there is more hurricane trouble on the way.
Tracking 2 hurricanes in the Atlantic.
The storm is expected to strengthen as it gains more steam.
This is New Day with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to your new day. It is Monday, September 18th, 8 o'clock here in the East. Chris is off. John Berman joins me. A very busy Monday.
Oh, yes.
So let's get right to it. All eyes on President Trump at the United Nations as he prepares to address world leaders for the first time on that stage. Much of the focus will be on how the president explains his America First agenda and his past skepticism of the UN.
North Korea's nuclear threat looming large over the annual gathering. U.S. officials warn Pyongyang that time is running out for a peaceful solution. U.S. bombers and fighter jets again today conducting drills over the Korean Peninsula. While that's going on, we're tracking 2 hurricanes posing a threat to the Northeast and the Caribbean. We have this all covered for you. Let's begin with the meetings at the United Nations. Michelle Kaczynski is there. Michelle.
Hi, John. Foreign delegations have been talking about this speech even days before it happens. They want to know, is this going to be President Trump on his best behavior? Is he going to stick to a script or not so much? And they want to see what is his tone in addressing them? Is he going to be supportive of the UN without criticism? And how is he going to articulate U.S. foreign policy beyond what they've already heard in the tweets, in the America First, and in multiple mixed messages? President Trump, now home in New York, but about to face the UN, a body he has sharply and repeatedly slammed.
The United Nations is not a friend of democracy. It's not a friend to freedom.
Where now he will also seek more cooperation to face the world's biggest problems. The president set the stage with a Sunday tweet storm, referring to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un as Rocket Man, and retweeting a video edited to show him knocking over former rival Hillary Clinton with a golf ball. Members of his administration out in front of cameras with more tough talk on the North Korean nuclear threat.
We don't have a lot of time left. If our diplomatic efforts fail, though, our military option will be the only one left.
Was the president's fire and fury remark an empty threat?
It was not an empty threat. I'm perfectly happy kicking this over to General Mattis because he has plenty of military options.
At the same time, though, the U.S. has been aggressively calling on China and Russia to do more to choke off Kim Jong-un's resources. Beijing and Moscow did vote in favor of unprecedented UN sanctions against North Korea, a step the president and his national security advisor have since downplayed, to the apparent chagrin of the State Department.
Are the sanctions a big deal or are they not a big deal?
Look,
because I've heard two really different things.
I think the sanctions, and I'm not going to go against the president, but I think the sanctions are significant.
Allies have been confused at times over what this administration values more, collaboration or going it alone. Trump's America First doctrine reflected in the three themes the president is expected to touch on in his speech Tuesday.
First is to protect the American people. The second is to promote American prosperity. And the third is really to help promote accountability and sovereignty.
The U.S. footprint at the UN this year, much smaller than it's been in the past. Meetings overall, fewer, leaving allies skeptical of how much the U.S. will be engaged on key agenda items like democracy promotion, refugees, and the environment. And how a nationalistic leader of the free world will embrace this global entity now.
I personally think he slaps the right people, he hugs the right people, and he comes out with U.S. being very strong in the end.
Among the big questions raised here by some of those mixed messages is the U.S. truly out of the Paris climate deal or not? Is the U.S. leaving the Iran nuclear deal? And looking ahead to the president's schedule today, on his first day, he will chair a session on reforming the UN, something he's pushed for to try to make it more efficient. He'll also be meeting with leaders of Israel, France, and tonight, Latin America. Allison and John.
Okay, Michelle, thank you for that preview. Let's bring in our political panel to discuss it. We have editor-at-large at Time Magazine and president of Eurasia Group, Ian Bremmer, and CNN political analyst David Gregory. David, what do we expect? Is there any way to tell what to expect from President Trump this week at the UN?
Well, just a few minutes ago on our air, Tony Blair was saying there is confusion and there is anxiety. And I think that's the principal aim here, is to try to clear some of that up. This is now President Trump on the world stage, a major international institution, one that he's been critical of. It is not unusual to have a new president to be looked at askance by the international community, and this president even more. He's also been unpredictable. We've seen that in domestic affairs just in the past couple of weeks, how he's worked with Democrats. Now there's some signaling that maybe he will find a way back in to the Paris Climate Accords. And there is a looming crisis over North Korea, where we're going to see the president privately and publicly ramp up pressure on North Korea, but also put pressure on, namely China, to play a bigger role to diffuse this growing nuclear threat from North Korea. So I think this is really going to be about tone. It's going to be about style, as people are still trying to take Trump's measure to gauge what we've seen so far versus where he may be heading.
Tone and style. And the appetizer to the speech this week is this statement that he made on Twitter about Kim Jong-un, Ian, calling him Rocket Man. Right here. I spoke with President Moon of South Korea last night, asked him how Rocket Man is doing. Long gas lines forming in North Korea, too bad. You liked Rocket Man.
Sure. It's clever. It's been used before. The Japanese used to call Kim Jong-il Rocket Monster. His dad. I mean, Trump's good at coming up with cute nicknames that everyone talks about, and here we are talking about it. Let's face it, the North Koreans are vastly better at propaganda than we are, and they say they're going to destroy us, and they're going to sink Japan, and they're going to leave nothing but ashes. I think he can handle a tweet that's going to only put Kim Jong-un more in the news. But to get back to David's point, look, what's interesting about Trump at the United Nations, when Trump gets insecure, he goes to his base. When he thinks the media is going badly, he goes to his base. On the international stage, he has no base. Even American allies privately look at Trump and say, who the hell is this guy? We don't trust him. We don't know about our relationship anymore. He'll be fine on the big stage, the UN General Assembly, because the speech is written for him. He reads speech well. The more formal it is, the fine. But in all of these off-camera moments, the one-on-ones with all of these heads of state, and then their delegations will be talking to each other, it's going to leak. You remember these conversations with the Australian Prime Minister, the Philippine President, all of that? That's where we've gotten some of the most salacious headlines because their staffs look at Trump and say, who the hell is this bozo? And what's going to happen this week is you're going to get a lot of that because they don't like him, they don't trust him, and offline, off camera, they say a lot of really snarky things.
That's interesting, right, David? I mean, because these meet and greets have been described as like speed dating on steroids. But if these conversations tend to be more provocative or even just less scripted, that'll be interesting to listen to.
Right, and I think the other side of that, and I'd be curious for Ian's take, is there is an opportunity to impress with a more strategic approach to North Korea. I do maintain, despite tweets about Rocket Man and some of the other things we've seen from the president, if you look at what he's actually done, what his national security team has actually done, it is to treat this seriously. It is to move forward both in the United Nations and dealing one-on-one with China to try to ramp up pressure there. This is not someone who's loosely talking about going to war. They've talked about all options on the table, but they're clearly positioning themselves to try to get into some kind of conversation with the North, some kind of dialogue, while really putting pressure on China, which, after all, has to be the most concerned not only about the potential for war, but also what would flow from that, which would be more U.S. influence in that part of the world, particularly in a potentially unified Korea. So these are things that China both fears and has some control over.
Ian, is there a coherent North Korea policy right now?
I think that the actual implementation of policy is pretty coherent. Let's keep in mind that the North Koreans, after the Americans made it pretty rough and credible that you come towards Guam, we're really going to hit you back, Kim Jong-un backed off pretty quickly, right?
But define that policy. So that means that we set some sort of red line, which is Guam, I guess, and they take notice. I mean, is that how it's working right now?
A couple things. One, it means that we are going to consistently talk the military angle, that if this really falls apart, we're running out of time, this isn't going to last through the next administration, whoever that is, you can't kick the can anymore. So either you get enough sanctions, enough pressure on North Korea that we actually see them change their behavior, or there is a possibility that there's going to be a military attack. Now, I don't think that we would engage militarily, but the credible questioning of the Chinese and North Koreans, the strategy is we'll bring them to the table. And at least on the Security Council, we've now seen 15-0 votes, which means not just our allies, but the Russians and the Chinese upping the ante and doing things that we've not seen under Obama, under Clinton, under Bush, in terms of squeezing the North Koreans. Now, let's see if they really execute on that, and let's see how the North Koreans respond. Nikki Haley deserves credit in pushing the Chinese, cajoling, engaging, and berating to get them all around the table and moving. Now, Kim Jong-un deserves more credit in ultimately ensuring that that's the reason that this is all coming together. But I think you have to say she's doing a pretty credible job.
Let me just add that if we remember even short-term history, going back to the Clinton administration, there was a negotiation with Kim's father that ultimately fell apart around a nuclear freeze. And, I remember President Bush talking about how Iran would never go nuclear on his watch. The truth is they kept buying time on that. And ultimately, the Obama administration has done the same, buying another 14 years if these deals keep getting recertified. I have to think that any administration wants to buy as much time with North Korea as possible.
We'll have to wait and see. Ian, I want to ask you about a couple other things. The Paris climate deal, there was some talk this weekend the administration might be willing to renegotiate or stay in it. They say, no, there's no change in our policy. Do you think there's any possibility for a change in the policy?
Not at this point, no. I think that they already took the political hits. We already know that there are, I think, 9 states that have said that they're going to be continue to commit to Paris climate goals. Over 300 cities have also said it, a whole bunch of corporations. I don't think that around the world governments are really concerned that the United States being out means that this whole thing is going to fall apart. But Trump gets to say, this is one of the things that I had promised during the campaign, and I'm going through on my commitment. I think there are people within his administration that are deeply unhappy about that. Some of them are leaking to the press. I'd be stunned if they actually did a flip on this.
And David, so curious about your thoughts on Paris as well as Iran nuclear deal. It sounds like the administration is rethinking some of the things that President Trump has threatened on that, too.
Well, again, it's how many crises do they want to take on at once? They don't want to unleash Iran to just resume its program. At least the existing accord buys America and its allies more time to keep Iran in check. And you heard David Sanger from the Times saying last hour that, the advice to the president is you can keep bashing Iran over this, just don't get all the way to the point of decertifying. My bigger question about climate policy and about the president's approach to the UN is one that I think is part of his domestic policy as well. The president has a base, as Ian said. He plays to that base when he feels insecure or under attack. But when he's attacked, it reminds him how much he dislikes being disliked and how legitimate he wants to be and appear on the world stage. And I think the opportunity to win, however the president defines that, and to be seen as a legitimate world leader is something that I think really appeals to him. And we've seen him start to make some compromises to position himself that way. And that's why I'm kind of eager to see how he approaches the UN and how much that will have changed from his campaign rhetoric.
Quickly?
I just say that, national security is the one place where Trump seems to know that he doesn't know things. And that's a good thing. You remember on NATO when he said, NATO's obsolete, got to get rid of it. And then later on he comes back and he says, well, look, I was a real estate guy. I didn't know anything about NATO. He would never admit that level of lack of knowledge on trade, on tax, on health care. I think that's why you've seen him go to the generals who know things. And ultimately, I think that gives us a little more feeling of security that he's not going off the rails on some of those issues.
Gentlemen, thank you. Thanks for the great conversation
Thanks.
and the preview. We have to talk about other big news. Hurricane Maria. Yes, respondent and host of Reliable Sources, Brian Stelter, joins us now with the highlights. Brian, great to see you. Special Counsel Robert Mueller and his team now have their hands on Russia-linked ads that ran on Facebook during the 2016 election. Now, a bipartisan group of senators wants to dig even deeper. One of those is Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand of New York. She is part of that effort, and she joins us now. Great to have you here in studio.
It's a pleasure.
So, what a travesty of what we're learning about with Facebook and these Russian troll farms that somehow were able to advertise on Facebook, and nobody was any the wiser, thinking that they were reading real retweets from real Americans and real information from Americans. But it wasn't, and it was all, if what has leaked out is to be believed, Russian troll farms behind it. What are you going to do about this?
So Senator Lindsey Graham and I have a bipartisan bill to do a deep dive, a 9/11 style commission that will look into how are we hacked, what were our cyber vulnerabilities, what are our cyber vulnerabilities today, and what can we do to prevent another type of interference in the 2018 election.
And what do you want Facebook and social media to do? If they're
they're not above the law, and it is illegal for foreign countries to undermine or participate in our elections. So buying those Facebook ads is illegal. So what we need is more disclosure and more accountability, more transparency. But they have a role to play, and we need to have much better accountability by the next election.
So you've not been impressed with their transparency thus far?
It's not adequate because they are responsible for people who buy their sites, who use their platform, and if they're breaking the law, there has to be some level of participation. So we are going to make sure that this deep dive reveals any vulnerabilities we have. We also have questions about were voting machines somehow interfered with.
Do you think they were? Because we've not seen evidence of that.
I've just heard some reports that there might have been efforts to decommission or somehow undermine different voting machines in different states, causing lines, causing people to not vote, particular states being targeted. So these are things that we need a full investigation of to see if there's any evidence of it, and then what evidence there is, and what can we do to protect ourselves next time.
Let's talk about another bit of bipartisanship that you're involved in, and that is you want to protect transgender military service members, particularly after what the president has just said in terms of a ban. So what are you going to do about that?
Well, these are men and women who are serving our country today, putting themselves in harm's way, risking their lives. No one should tell them they cannot serve based on their gender identity. And so I have a bipartisan bill with Senator McCain, Jack Reed ranking on the Dem side, along with Susan Collins, and Susan and I worked together to write the bill to say if you are serving today, you are protected, you cannot be kicked out, and that you may re-enlist.
And what about future people who want to enlist?
So that's the question, and that's what Secretary Mattis is doing right now, is analyzing what he intends to do in the future. But while that's happening, we want to make sure no one can be kicked out, because again, this goes to our basic civil rights and civil liberties. If someone is willing to die for this country, you should not tell them they can't serve.
Another topic that I want to talk to you about, because you and I have both worked on this in the past, and that's campus sexual assault. Education Secretary Betsy DeVos has said publicly that she wants to kind of revisit the guidance from the Obama administration in terms of how universities should handle this widespread problem of campus sexual assault. And it sounded as though what she wanted to look at was how to better protect. One of the things that she wanted to look at was how to make the system work better, she says, and to protect the falsely accused. What do you think of that?
Well, I have a concern that she doesn't understand the dynamics of these cases very well. I don't want an innocent person getting in trouble or being accused any more than I want a guilty person going free. And so we want to have a system. So we have a bipartisan bill right now in the Senate, and if she really wants to fix the problem, she should support our bill. It's widely supported by Democrats and Republicans, and the most important part of our bill is to have an online survey that students get to fill out every 2 years to say, number one, is my campus safe? What's the climate like? Have I been assaulted? If so, have I reported? If not, why not? You will get a snapshot in time for every college campus in America to say, what's the campus like? If they report on these surveys, there was 35 assaults last year and not one has actually been reported, you know you have a problem with your reporting structure or people's confidence in the system you have. And our bill really creates protections both for the accused and the accuser. We want to make sure that every school is well trained to basically have a certification process to say you know what you're doing when you're doing and reviewing these cases. And then another point that law enforcement's developed is having one confidential advisor on every campus. So if you are a victim of sexual assault, you have someone to go to and she or he can tell you, this is what it looks like if you report on campus. You can only receive accommodation. You can get your class schedule changed, you can get your dorm changed, but it's only accommodation, and best case scenario, your assailant is kicked out. If you go to criminal justice, that means jail time, that means going through a trial. And I'll tell you, when you tell a survivor, if this happens again to someone else or a third person, will you be willing to testify? Typically she says yes. And then the advisor can say, well, then you should get your rape kit done today. Because if you want to preserve your ability to testify in the future, that has to be done. It's a reason to do those kinds of things that, you know, an 18-year-old girl on a college campus might not want to do otherwise. So that's the key, getting more cases to ultimately go to law enforcement, but giving guidance to that individual on the first day about what are your options. That usually results in more cases ultimately going to law enforcement.
Okay, next topic. There seems to be a lot of analysis about the 2016 election going on all sides still. That was in our rearview mirror, but Hillary Clinton, as you know, has her new book out. So she's been talking a lot about what she thinks, what she blames for her loss. She was just on PBS this weekend, and she was asked about that infamous now tarmac meeting between then Attorney General Loretta Lynch and Bill Clinton. So let me play for you whether or not Hillary Clinton thinks that that was to some degree responsible for her loss. Listen to this.
To what extent did Loretta Lynch and President Clinton make a costly mistake?
Judy, I just don't buy that. I honestly reject that premise, partly because there's a chain of command in the Justice Department. The optics, you know, were not good. I admit that. What really was costly, and what I believe was the proximate cause of my defeat, was his October 28th letter.
Of course, she's talking about James Comey there. Do you think that in terms of that tarmac meeting, it was just bad optics?
So my view of this is we're looking forward to the 2018 elections, and I'm grateful that Secretary Clinton ran for president. I'm grateful that she's written her book because it's important for women to be heard in all places and to be able to tell their story. But fundamentally for me, that election is about how she inspired millions of people across the globe to stand up for what they believe in, to fight your hardest, win or lose. And as a result, we have thousands of women running for office this cycle. Emily's List reported that there were typically 1,000 or 2,000 women wanting to be trained and run at this time in the cycle. We have 14,000. And so I'm grateful for what Secretary Clinton has done, and I think she's inspired millions. And so I'm focused on how can we win these seats in 2018, and how can we encourage more candidates to come forward to run and to provide that oversight and accountability over President Trump.
Who's the leader of the Democratic Party right now?
I think you have your congressional leaders, of course, but I think, you know, Senator Sanders is out there talking about things that has big ideas like Medicare for all. I think Elizabeth Warren's out there talking about a rigged system that we desperately need to fix for working families. And for each of us who are running for re-election, such as myself and 24 other Senate Democrats, We're in our states talking about our vision and what we want to change and how we want to make a difference and how we want to make the economy grow.
But are they the national leaders, as you see it, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren?
I think that's how they're perceived, and I think they're doing a great job in terms of speaking out on the issues that matter to most people. But you won't really have a national leader Democrat until you have a nominee. So between now and then, you're really focused on state by state, winning over voters, listening to voters, hearing why they were so distressed in the last election, why many of them chose to vote for a disruptor, someone who was going to blow up the system, as opposed to someone who might have spoke to their values and goals better. And so we have to listen a lot harder, and then we have to work a lot harder in getting things done, actually passing legislation like things that will help people, rewarding work in this country, having paid leave in this country, having a minimum wage that's a living wage, things that could actually help people's lives, and we have to get that done.
What are your thoughts personally on 2020?
I think there's going to be a huge interest in trying to bring our country in a different direction. I think some of the policies that have come under the Trump administration have been really harmful, whether it's attacking DACA kids, whether it's attacking transgender troops, whether it's not investing in infrastructure, not investing in the middle class.
Right, but these are all issues that you care about. Are you thinking about running in 2020?
I'm focused on 18, so I'm focused on my reelection. I'd like to be a senator.
But at some point, I mean, is that in your future?
Well, I'm focused on being a senator, so that's all I'm doing right now. And I think
if there were a void or a vacuum in 2020 and nobody had emerged, would you throw your hat in?
You can ask me that question then, and I promise to answer it.
It'll be too late in 2020. I mean, look, are you comfortable with it being Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, or do you think that there's room for perhaps somebody who, I mean, they're seen as being quite on the left?
I think there's so much room. I mean, I think there's many people who plan to run. Certainly the pundits have talked about a list of at least 20 people who are thinking about running. So I'm certain we will have a whole array of fantastic candidates with different experience, some Senate experience, some gubernatorial, some private sector, and they'll all be sharing their vision for what they want for this country. And I think that will be a vibrant process and an exciting process, and I look forward to it. But in the meantime, we have to, I think all of us, focus on the importance of 2018 because we need to flip the House. We need to create a bulwark against some of President Trump's policies that are so harmful to the economy, so harmful to middle-class families. And that's what we have to do for me as a senator who's running for re-election, but also for anyone interested in politics to campaign for candidates that are trying to change the direction of this country.
Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, thanks so much for being here for such a comprehensive conversation.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Great to have you here in
Thank
studio.
You.
John.
I'm focused on 2018, Allison. It's going to be my answer tonight when my wife asked me to do something I don't want to do. All right, American students targeted in France, attacked with acid. Investigators say it's not a case of terrorism. Why not? The latest next.
These guys on your left and right, they will always be there, no matter what.
Special Counsel Robert Mueller's team now in possession from information from Facebook that could be linked to Russia, and it all has to do with the presidential election. The Special Counsel's office obtained a search warrant for the information. That is a huge deal. It could signal a significant turn in the investigation. Let's bring back our political panel, John Avlon, David Drucker, A.B. Stoddard. Look, the Special Counsel, in order to get this warrant, had to go to a judge and say, hey, we have evidence of criminal wrongdoing here. We need this information you have. Facebook says we won't turn over said information without a search warrant. This feels like a shift.
You can tell that Mueller is focusing in on these very specific things like obstruction of justice, the June 16th meeting, the obstruction of justice on firing of Comey, the crafting of a letter aboard an airplane home from Hamburg, Germany, with several associates and Trump about the June 16th, 2016 meeting. And he's focusing in on whether or not there was any collusion between a Trump associate helping Russian ad buyers on Facebook target certain places to reach certain voters. That would be the closest evidence of any kind of straightforward collusion we've come to see. And just as you said, a subpoena where he has to show cause, probable cause of a crime means that it's more than just a couple of Russian people buying some ads on Facebook.
And this is a question about when these Russian entities were buying these Facebook ads and deploying them potentially to millions of American people, and we know that they seem to have been promoting anti-immigration rallies. They seem to be very investigated. Was there any knowledge by anyone in the Trump orbit? It becomes a question, not only what did the Trump campaign know and when did they know it, but what did Facebook know and when did they know it? And the only time they're going to be willing to give this critical information is under a subpoena.
That's right, because Facebook has not been transparent
Correct.
about all of this
Not at
stuff,
all.
David Drucker. They haven't wanted to tell the American people exactly what the extent of the Russian troll farms buying these ads and then proliferating them
Right. So
around.
I'm a little sympathetic to Facebook just because of the controversy of whether or not technology companies like this are going to share information provided to them by their customers, by their advertisers. As we know in Washington, with the National Security Agency's spying powers, there has been a huge debate over how much information the government should have access to unless it's part of a criminal case. What I would say about this that is super interesting is that there's always been two issues as a part of the 2016 campaign that we've been trying to figure out. One is the collusion issue. Was there collusion between Trump, his associates, and people working against Hillary Clinton, primarily the Russians? The other issue was, did the Russians meddle? A lot of people don't like the idea that the Russians meddled on behalf of Trump. It makes them uncomfortable.
Who likes that idea?
Well, if you're a Trump supporter, and I have had these discussions
But
with
they think
Trump
it's a good
supporters,
thing?
they don't think that the Russians would have wanted to help Trump. They would have wanted to help Clinton because that would signal that Trump maybe was not such a good guy.
That's a hermetically sealed universe.
Well, these, as you know, these tribal universes exist. But my point is, what this shows possibly is some real concrete evidence of Russian meddling, which, if you follow this issue from the summer of 2015 on, would not surprise you in the least. Putin and his nationalist government always liked the idea of Trump. He was still mad at Hillary Clinton because he thought as Secretary of State, she intervened in his last election. And so,
And he would never say
but
anything
this
negative,
is
guys.
something that people can get their hands around.
Two people concerned about this had a loud dinner at a Washington restaurant over the weekend. You know, Ty Cobb, who's the president's White House lawyer on this subject, and John Dad was there as well. And the New York Times overheard this conversation, which is astounding to me, two high-priced lawyers, and they were talking about whether or not the White House had a right to protect certain documents and how far they should go in turning over information there. But, AB, you know, what's your take on this story in the New York Times? Remarkable, these guys making a lot of money having a loud conversation for reporters to hear.
These were the ones who were brought in because the inside game was so weak that they needed other outside counsel
professionals.
To come in, graybeards to come in and sort of clean up this act. They're sitting there at a restaurant that we all know is literally steps from the New York Times bureau. It is paces. And talking about stuff about these internal fights over who is not trusting who to produce documents. And it's just an example of how much fighting and actually still leaking is going on. They weren't intentionally leaking there.
Or maybe they were. I mean, honestly,
can I just say how jealous I am, by the way? Because I daydream about scoops like this. I mean, all we do in Washington is hang out at, this is the closest you'll get to a Georgetown cocktail party, quote unquote, is a restaurant where a lot of us all hang out for one reason or another. And I always think, maybe I'll overhear something tonight. Never happens. And these guys got it.
It was a great scoop by Vogel, and he's sitting right there, and it's a sign of just how you know, competence should not be overestimated in people. But one of the lines that really jumps out is Ty Cobb of the Hall of Fame mustache saying that Don McGahn, White House counsel, has got documents in his safe that he won't turn over. That's significant. I mean, that's you know, so expect, you know, sign a coming attraction on that one.
Also the McGahn spy, which tells you that there's still a lack of trust inside where they feel like the different lawyers and different advisors are working against each other on this.
Okay, let's talk about what President Trump retweeted over the weekend. It was this doctored video of him hitting Hillary Clinton in the head or back with a golf ball and knocking her over. So, John, I just don't even know. I mean, I'm sure the White House will say this is just a joke, just a joke.
Yeah.
But I mean, the interesting thing about jokes is that they're usually funny. And this is just weird and juvenile and everything else.
Are you saying it's not presidential, Alice?
I guess it is what I'm saying.
If Abraham Lincoln had Twitter, he would have done the same thing. No, I'm kidding. Obviously, the point is that Twitter Trump is the real Trump, and the president is attracted at the early morning hours to juvenile videos that often involve violence to his enemies. This may be a, hey, can't you get a sense of humor aspect? The fact that the account that had tweeted it out had a very typically unsavory history.
Oh, yeah. The name itself is disgusting from what he tweeted it out.
Yeah. So, but this just shows where the president's at. is sort of high school bully level humor.
But it's also, you know, a former high school football player who cannot stop reliving his old glory, AB. It just seems like all he wants to talk about whenever he can is the fact that he beat Hillary Clinton in the election.
It's interesting because those two things. One, he had a tough week with the base last week, and he made, you know, plans with Chuck and Nancy, and he's worried about some blowback from that on Breitbart News. So he's trying to beat up on Hillary Clinton because his fans like that. But but behind the scenes, people will tell you that in White House discussions in private, he still brings up his victory against the Clinton machine as a reason for why he knows better than them on decision making when they're in just private small settings.
Yeah, and this has mileage because so much of his electoral base was motivated by the idea of Trump as their avatar, thumbing his nose at the system, just acting unpresidential for them is why they actually elected him. And so doing this every once in a while, as much as I think Trump is in so many ways a political id without any strategic forethought, I think when he does this sort of thing, he understands who's going to react to it and how they're going to react to it. And I think from his point of view, that works just fine for him. The interesting thing about the idea of who lacks a sense of humor is when this sort of thing is turned around on the president, there is no sense of humor whatsoever from him or his advisors in the White House.
Fair point. Panel, thank you very much.
All right, we got a lot of other news this morning. 2 hurricanes churning in the Atlantic, posing a threat to some already battered by Irma last week. We're going to have the latest forecast tracks. That's next.
The Emmy Awards last night had lots of memorable moments, but one in particular has everyone buzzing this morning.
What really matters to Donald Trump is ratings. Unfortunately, at this point, we have no way of knowing how big our audience is. I mean, is there anyone who could say how big the audience is? Sean, do you know?
This will be the largest audience to witness an Emmys, period. Both in person and around the world.
Wow, that really soothes my...
All right, let's bring in CNN media analyst Bill Carter and CNN political analyst and New York Times deputy culture editor Patrick Healy. Great to have you guys. So, Patrick, was that like a tacit admission from Sean Spicer that when he said those very same words in the White House press briefing room that they were a lie or not true or a joke?
Yeah, I think Sean Spicer's been looking for a moment like this to show that he's ready and willing to sort of go there and to make fun of himself and to really, you know, sort of definitely create some space from President Trump. But it created a lot of discomfort. There were a lot of, a lot of Democrats, a lot of liberals in that audience watching home on TV who were not ready to go kind of the normalizing route. I think you just look at Melissa McCarthy's reaction during that moment. As she has said before, you know, my impression of Sean Spicer on SNL, it's not a joke between me and Sean Spicer. This is our joke. This is our critique of the Trump White House and politics. And it's not something that a lot of people are comfortable with.
Well, first of all, I'm not sure it was a tacit admission. It felt like an explicit admission that perhaps Sean was saying things that weren't true when he said the crowd size was the biggest ever. But Bill, it was funny.
Well, that's it. I mean, you have to give comedians a comic moment. And then, here's Stephen Colbert. He wants to be funny. This is a funny bit. Look at the audience reaction. They went wild when they saw this. And
It's
it was
a blurring of lines
moment.
of our world. Yes, Stephen Colbert wants to be funny, but Sean Spicer's tasked with telling the truth. So how are we to analyze this?
Here's the thing. The people who criticized were mostly people saying he's a liar and he's a hypocrite, etc. But, he was criticizing Trump as well. He was like saying this moment turns out to not have been particularly true, and he made things up the way he was making things up there. So he was mocking himself and he's mocking Trump. And I think that's partly what this show was about. But the show, it wasn't like there weren't shots at Trump all over the place, all over that show. He was called Walter Whiter than White. He was called a lying bigot by Lily Tomlin and Jane Fonda.
We have it. Let's listen to some of these that took some shots at President Trump.
And your show has been, that thing you say about Trump being bad, it's So fresh, so fresh.
Thank you.
Back in 1980, in that movie, we refused to be controlled by a sexist, egotistical, lying, hypocritical bigot.
Really? And in 2017, we still refuse to be controlled by a sexist, egotistical, lying, hypocritical bigot.
I want to thank Trump for making black people #1 on the most oppressed list. He's the reason I'm probably up here.
We did have a whole storyline about an impeachment, but we abandoned that because we were worried that someone else might get to it first.
Yeah.
Poor Dolly Parton.
She did not look comfortable.
Right, because her audience, I mean,
Yes.
sure, you know, in
And I have to
Dolly's.
say, if you're one of the people who Louis Dreyfus line was pretty funny. I mean, that's a joke she was making.
Yeah, but look, these things always get political, right? I mean,
Right.
that's always fodder
Yes,
for
right.
the Emmys. But the Sean Spicer thing was definitely a new wrinkle. Adding a real person saying fake things
Sure.
for the punchline, all of that is where it gets muddy.
Right, and I mean, Stephen Colbert made a very deliberate choice. He wanted to have this moment. He thought that bringing Spicer out there, having Melissa McCarthy in the audience, would create some.
They're a cash crop.